Hello everybody, Disciple here with Hearthstone Curios. We've gotten some pretty exciting news lately, both in that Spirit Claws and Small Time Buccaneer are getting nerfed, and in the fact that some cards from the Classic set are going to be rotating into Wild. Sylvanas, Ragnaros, Azure Drake, Power Overwhelming, Ice Lance, and Conceal are all getting put into the Hall of Fame, meaning that they'll no longer be allowed in standard decks, despite being in a standard legal set. While both the nerfs and Hall of Fame have an obvious effect on the decks that play those cards directly, they'll also impact other archetypes in slightly more subtle ways. That's why today we thought we'd talk about a couple of the decks or classes that benefit or are hurt by some of these changes, both directly and indirectly. Let's get right into it. Now, the Buccaneer nerf is definitely going to hit a lot of different decks, since even things like Miracle Rogue play a couple pirates for patches, and Spirit Claws also being nerfed means that both aggro and mid-range shaman are getting hit the hardest of all, which is pretty well deserved since they have around a 59% win rate from rank 10 to legend. But this actually means that a couple decks are getting pretty big buffs as well. We haven't really seen a ton of the traditional early game decks lately, like Hunter, Zoo, or Tempo Mage, and that's mainly because the decks running pirates have such efficient early game that it becomes impossible to compete and they just get overrun early. The fact that two of the most oppressive early game cards in standard are getting nerfed means that some other aggro or tempo decks might get the chance to finally shine, and that's pretty exciting considering we haven't seen a lot of these decks get played in quite some time, and Hunters are about 0.5% of the meta at the moment. Another huge buff is going to be to Jade decks, specifically Jade Druid, since Jade Shaman was already doing alright, but Jade Druid has been a deck that's been constantly punished by aggro, and that's really the only reason it hasn't erupted into the meta yet. Jade Druid has an excellent win rate against Reno decks like Reno Lock and Reno Mage, and without aggro to keep it down so bad early on, we might see it get some time to ramp up and curve out to have that insanely strong late game that we were so afraid of when Jade cards were first announced. Possibly even bigger than the nerfs news though is the Hall of Fame announcement, because it says that in addition to the normal rotation, these cards are going to be taken out of standard from the Classic set. Now, all the cards that were removed are very powerful on their own and have all had their places in top decks throughout Hearthstone history, so let's take a look at them on a card-by-card basis. Ice Lance getting taken out of standard is really huge since the 1-mana burn spell was a staple in Freeze Mage, which has been around since the beginning of Hearthstone, and it allowed you to do crazy amounts of damage for low cost, especially when you combined it with things like Frostbolt. Emperor Thaurissan made Ice Lance especially scary, since a free 4 or more damage from one card is insane, and let Freeze Mage burst people down from crazy high life totals. It feels like, unless other cards are implemented, that this will pretty much kill Freeze Mage for the future, since Ice Lance was such a huge staple and they're going to lose very important cards like Emperor Thaurissan once he rotates out in the next expansion. Now, a lot of slow control decks like Control Priest or Handlocked potentially struggled against Freeze Mage when the deck was good, so it being neutered for the future means that these decks have even more potential later on. Any control deck that is liable to be burst down from a high life total after they've tried to stabilize with taunts is definitely going to get a lot stronger now that there won't be Freeze Mage in the meta potentially in the future. Additionally, with Power Overwhelming being taken out of standard, which ends up having a pretty similar effect to Ice Lance rotating out, a lot of these control decks that are just weak to the huge combos are going to have a lot of time to shine and hopefully get some time to build up their win condition and really take over games in the late game. For a long time, Power Overwhelming has been a combo piece alongside Leroy and Faceless Manipulator to deal 20 or more damage to the opponent in one turn. But with Power Overwhelming leaving and Emperor Thaurissan rotating out, Reno Lock won't really have that combo option anymore, and both Reno Lock and Freeze Mage no longer having as much burst definitely means that slower decks should tend to do a little bit better. Two more cards that are entering the Hall of Fame are Azure Drake and Conceal, which, along with the Buccaneer nerf, are going to make Miracle Rogue a lot weaker. Miracle Rogue relies a lot on Conceal for free wins here and there, and it's such a strong combo with Gadgetzan Auctioneer, and with it being taken out, it makes it a lot easier to interact with them and their cards. This means that decks that can have a hard time killing Stealth Auctioneer, like any sort of Druid or others like aggro and mid-range decks, should start to fare a little bit better, along with other decks that are just weak in the rogue matchup in general, like Priest and Warrior have been in the past. But Azure Drake leaving changes a lot more than just rogue, and it's leaving with some other insane mid-range staples, so that should shake up the meta a lot, to a point where it's probably way too hard to predict. It makes sense that Ragnaros, Sylvanas, and Azure Drake are all leaving hand in hand, since these cards have been in the same decks over and over since Hearthstone's inception, and it's about time that people explored some other options. These cards leaving should definitely open up mid-range and control players to trying out other creative finishers and maybe some new combos, but at the same time it'll tear down the Hearthstone we know and love and create something completely new. Azure Drake leaving means that spell damage swipes from Druid are going to be a lot more unlikely, and Rogue will need to draw things like Thalnos to make their Phantom Knives or Backstabs any bigger, and the Shaman spell damage deck probably just won't be good enough anymore, especially with that Spirit Claws nerf. Sylvanas and Ragnaros are somewhat more replaceable, but they're still incredibly efficient cards that destroy the competition at their respective mana slots, so we'll probably see a ton of variety in control and mid-range deck choices as a result of them leaving. Overall, we're probably going to see a buff to high value cards like Keion Bloodhoof in that 6 mana slot instead of Sylvanas, and other larger cards like Alexstrasza or Ysera instead of Ragnaros to try and fill in that late game win condition. Overall, while these changes make control and mid-range decks a little bit weaker, they only make them weaker against each other and not really against aggro at all, since it wasn't Ragnaros that was winning you the game against those aggro warriors. The most important factor against aggro is removal and healing, because once you stabilize against them, it really doesn't matter what you win with. This means that overall these changes are pretty good, since they force mid-range and control decks to use a lot more diverse options against each other, and it really doesn't come down to whose Ragnaros snipes whose. And they don't really hurt these decks too much against aggro. Especially with the Buccaneer and Spirit Claws nerf, we're pretty okay with saying goodbye to Azure Drake, even if it means smaller swipes, because as a result we should get a pretty new and diverse meta. Of course, we say this pretty much every expansion and then it just comes back to aggro dominating the meta, so who knows, maybe we'll just have to bow down to small-time Recruits Paladin and hand buff Hunter aggro, but maybe we'll also see a huge variety of decks. So those are some of our thoughts on how both the nerfs and the Hall of Fame announcement might affect Standard, but I want to know what you guys think is going to happen. It looks like that's going to be it from me. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like if you want, and if not, that's okay too. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.